Today, we're diving into the surprisingly deep and complex story behind one of the world's most popular spirits, vodka. And believe me, it's a story that's about so much more than just a clear drink in a cocktail glass. Let's get into it. So when you think of vodka, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's something clear, neutral, maybe a little harsh. You might think of it as white whiskey or just that stuff you mix with orange juice. And I bet you're thinking it's Russian. Well, as we're about to find out, that's just scratching the surface of a much bigger and way more interesting story. So let's start with the absolute basics, the name itself. The word vodka actually comes from the Slavic word voda, which just means water. The ka at the end makes it a diminutive, a smaller version. So vodka literally means little water. Kind of simple for a drink that's basically just alcohol and, well, water. But don't let that simple name fool you, because it's got a much grander past. Way back when, this stuff wasn't called little water. It was known by its Latin name, aqua vitae, which means the water of life. See, early alchemists and doctors weren't thinking about cocktails. They saw this as powerful medicine, a base for perfumes, and some even thought it might be the legendary fifth element they were looking for. So, how did we get from the mystical water of life to the vodka we know today? Well, here's our game plan. We're going to look at its medicinal roots, get into the heated debate over where it was born, break down the science of how it's made, see how it took over the world, and then we'll peek into the future. All right, let's dive right into our first section. What is little water? We're rewinding the clock all the way back to the very beginnings of distillation. Now, you might think the story starts in the snowy fields of Eastern Europe, but actually, you've got to go back to 8th century Arab alchemists. That's where it all began. The technique made its way to Europe a few centuries later, eventually landing in Moscow in 1386. But the moments that really matter for our story happen in the 15th century. First, in 1405, the Polish word vodka shows up in some court documents, but it's referring to medicine. Then, just a few decades later, around 1430, a monk in Moscow supposedly creates the first spirit from grain mash, which they called bread wine. And right there, that's where the big fight begins. Which brings us to our second section, the huge debate, Poland versus Russia. And trust me, this is way more than just bragging rights. For both of these countries, being the birthplace of vodka is a massive point of national pride. So who's got the better claim? Well, Poland's argument is pretty straightforward. They used the word vodka first, on paper, back in 1405. Russia's claim is a little different. They say, yeah, but we were the first to make a real drinkable spirit from grain, our bread wine, and we made it a state business almost immediately. So basically, Poland has the name, but Russia claims they invented the actual drink. It's a debate that is still very much alive today. Okay, let's step out of the history books and into the distillery for a bit. Section 3, the science of smoothness. How in the world do you go from a pile of potatoes or some wheat to that crystal clear stuff in the bottle? The modern process is really a beautiful mix of science and craft. It all starts with sourcing great ingredients. Then, during fermentation, yeast gets to work eating up all the sugars and turning them into alcohol. After that, distillation heats everything up to separate out and concentrate that pure ethanol. Then comes filtration, which is absolutely key for that clean taste. And finally, you just dilute it with pure water to get the right strength and pop it in a bottle. Now, this is where things get really interesting. You see, while we usually think of grains like rye and wheat, or maybe potatoes for that creamier vibe, you can technically make vodka from almost anything that has starch or sugar in it. We're talking grapes, corn, sugar beets, even rice. And each one of those base ingredients leaves its own subtle little signature on the final taste and feel of the spirit. The whole point of vodka is purity, right? And filtration is how you get there. This shows just a few ways distillers chase that perfect smoothness. The old school, most common method is using activated charcoal. It just soaks up all the unwanted stuff. But these days, craft distillers are using everything you can imagine. Quartz sand, even silver to get extra clarity. Some even freeze filter their vodka, chilling it way down to remove impurities. All right, let's tackle one of the biggest legends in the entire world of spirits. I'm sure you've heard this one. Dmitri Mendeleev, the genius who created the periodic table of elements, was also the guy who figured out that vodka should be exactly 40% alcohol. But is that actually true? The short answer? Nope, It's a fantastic story for sure, but it's a total myth. Mendeleev did not invent 40% vodka. So, what's the real story? Well, his doctoral dissertation back in 1865 was about combining alcohol and water. His work was super important because it allowed for really precise measurement, and the Russian government used that science decades later in 1894 to set an official standard of 40%. But it wasn't about finding the perfect taste. It was about consistency, quality control, and, let's be honest, making it a whole lot easier to tax. Okay, so vodka is standardized. It's being produced efficiently. But how did it break out of its home in the vodka belt of Eastern Europe and become a global superstar? That brings us to Section 4, how vodka conquered the world. It really happened in a few big waves. It started back in 1864, when Smirnoff got industrial production going in Moscow. But the real game changer was the Russian Revolution in 1917. That event forced distillers like Vladimir Smirnoff to flee the country, and they took their secret recipes and brand names with them. The first distillery opened in the US in 1934, but the real explosion happened in the 1950s, right in the middle of the American cocktail craze. And the secret to its success in America? Pure marketing genius. The slogan was, "It leaves you breathless." Just brilliant. It sold vodka not as some harsh spirit from a foreign land, but as a clean, modern, white whiskey that had no color, no real taste, and crucially left no smell on your breath. That made it the perfect invisible base for cocktails like the Moscow Mule, and America absolutely fell in love. Which brings us to today. For decades, vodka's entire identity was built on this idea of being neutral, of being invisible, but that's all starting to change. So let's get into our final section, the future in a glass. And one of the biggest words you'll hear thrown around the vodka world now is one that's been borrowed from wine, terroir. Terroir is just this French idea that the specific place where your ingredients come from, the soil, the climate, all of it, leaves a unique flavor fingerprint on the final product. This idea of terroir is really part of a much bigger shift. We're seeing this huge wave of super premium vodkas that are all about quality ingredients from specific places. The craft distilling movement is putting a new focus on unique, artisanal methods. And of course, just like everywhere else, sustainability is becoming a huge deal, with more and more people wanting organic ingredients and eco-friendly production. You know, the Russian writer Viktor Yerofeev once nailed the classic definition of the spirit. Vodka is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. And for a very long time, that's exactly what it was supposed to be. And honestly, that neutrality was its greatest strength. It's what made it the ultimate mixer. But today's distillers are basically taking that idea and flipping it on its head. They're out to prove that this little water can actually have a huge personality, that it can have character, complexity, and a real story that's tied to the land it came from. Which really leaves us with the big question. When we look at the future of vodka, what are we looking for? Is it that relentless scientific pursuit of absolute purity that made it a global icon in the first place? Or is it this exciting, newfound personality being crafted by a whole new generation of distillers? Right now, it seems the answer is still being distilled.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more How Meets History.